Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Fleur, and welcome to the Certificate 4 in Hospitality run by HITsa. My name is Owen Webb. I'm a Senior Industrial Relations Advocate with the AHA here in South Australia, so the Australian Hotels Association, and I'm pleased to be delivering your work health and safety, diversity and workplace bullying training session this morning. In terms of my background, I've worked with the AHA for about 2.5 years now, and then prior to that I worked as a regional HR manager with an accommodation hotel group, and then prior to that I also have worked in the pub environment as well, working in HR and also with other employer associations as well. So I'm certainly familiar with the sorts of issues and intricacies that you go through on a day-to-day basis, being in managerial positions that you are. And certainly being on the end of a number of phone calls at the AHA, we get a lot of different sorts of scenarios. And I always say to someone, if you want to work in HR, in human resources, the hospitality environment's a really good environment to work in because you just get the whole gamut of issues on a day-to-day basis. In terms of today's session, just a couple of sort of housekeeping issues. As I mentioned, we'll go through to lunchtime today. We do have a copy of the presentation, so don't panic. Of course, we strongly recommend that you go through and write as many notes as possible, but we do have a copy of the presentation as well. We've also got some handouts that we're going to go through with you as well, and we're going to do some group exercises because I want to make sure that you guys are not just sitting stagnant for the whole time today. So we will break up into groups as we go along. The other thing as well is please just ask as many questions as you like as we go along today. It's supposed to be as interactive as possible. Interrupt me as we go along. It's about you walking away with as much information as you possibly can so that you're armed with all the information in terms of actually fulfilling your requirements when it comes to your assessments. So please ask as many questions as you can. I think Fleur just mentioned before the bathroom area. But it's through these doors and up the end here, and also just in terms of emergency evacuation, we'll all just follow Fleur downstairs through the emergency exits, given we're talking about work health and safety, and through to the designated assembly point if there is an emergency. So bear with us. All right. So today's topic is, and hopefully you can see this without me moving too much for the cameras, but in terms of this session, we're going to be focusing on managing work health and safety and diversity in the workplace. And realistically, we could probably talk about this topic for the next 3 weeks, to be brutally honest. There is so much information, literature, legislation that deals with this particular area, but it's important that we give you a good snapshot today and a brief overview so that you can walk away with that information for your assessments. The first part of the session that we're going to look at is really just getting a broad understanding of the legislation when it comes to work health and safety and diversity, and we've got some exercises that we'll work through there. We're then going to look at broadly what sorts of things do we need to implement and monitor when it comes to work health and safety and diversity in the workplace. So we need to make sure that businesses are compliant from a legislative point of view. So what are the various things that a business would need to look at to make sure that they're implementing and monitoring appropriate practices. We're also going to talk about developing consultative arrangements, what that means, and also look at things like records. What sort of records do we need to keep in the workplace? What sort of auditing material might we need? What do we need to be recording in terms of incidents? What's the importance of the reports? What can we do with them? All those sorts of things. So we'll run through that today. We will have a couple of breaks as we go along in today's session as well, so it'll give you some time to refresh. Okay, so firstly, in terms of the work health and safety legislation, as you can see from the diagram here, it's really a tiered framework, if you like, where up the top we've got the Act, and here in South Australia we've got the Work Health and Safety Act of 2012. Underneath that we've got the regulations. So we've got the Work Health and Safety Regulations 2012 as well here in South Australia. And then underneath that we've got National Codes of Practice. But just before I delve into that, I think it's important for you to get an understanding of the fact that there's been quite a lot of changes over the last couple of years here in South Australia when it's come to work health and safety, and in particular nationally as well. What has effectively happened is, if we go back a step into about 2007, 2008, at the time the COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, basically got together and decided that we've got a whole range of different state-based legislation when it comes to work health and safety, and effectively what we want to try and do is come up with some harmonised legislation. So basically they signed an agreement between all the councils of Australian government to say, all right, we need to go away and develop some model legislation. So in about 2008, 2009, they also set up a body called Safe Work Australia. And you might have heard of that particular body, but basically it's an independent body that effectively sets up the overall model legislation from a work health and safety perspective. So what they did is that they went away in 2009 and got a lot of feedback from the unions throughout the country, employer associations, work health and safety practitioners, lawyers, those working in the field, to come up with a model act and a model set of regulations. And then what they did slowly through 2012 is that model legislation was broadly taken out to all of the different states and territories, and each state and territory went through the process of actually putting these acts through their parliament, and that's what we term the idea of work health and safety harmonisation. Now, there are still two states that are not a part of this harmonised legislation, and that's Victoria and Western Australia, as at today's date, as far as I'm aware. They're still currently working under their old state-based legislation. But here in South Australia, we've gone with what we call the model legislation. And that became operative from the 1st of January 2013. Each state does have a few little nuances, a few little changes, but broadly speaking, it's based on this model legislation developed through Safe Work Australia. Now, in terms of what each piece of legislation really does, if we look at the Work Health and Safety Act, that really broadly sets out the framework of work health and safety, and it talks about the broad duties, what employees and employers need to be doing to make sure that their workplace is compliant. It also sets out things like penalties. So if a business, for example, was prosecuted by Safe Work SA, for argument's sake, because there'd been a significant injury in the workplace, they may indeed prosecute against the business based on the penalties that exist in the Work Health and Safety Act. So that's the broad sort of piece of legislative framework. Underneath that, we've got the regulations. And really what the regulations do is they set out some more specific information to help businesses to work out how they need to control work health and safety within their business. So if you wanted to find out about hazardous chemicals, if you wanted to find out about access and egress, manual handling, if you wanted to find out about electrical safety or asbestos, what I'd be saying to you is that it's there specified in the regulations. So that goes into more depth about specific work health and safety areas. Now, in terms of the Act and the regulations, they are law. So they've been passed by Parliament, so they are legislative, and therefore they need to be followed. National codes of practice are a little bit different. What Safe Work SA did was that they have slowly been developing a range of codes of practice. And if you want to get an idea of what a code of practice is, I've just picked up an example here, which is first aid in the workplace. So that's been developed by Safe Work Australia, and effectively what it does is it sets out a practical guidance material for businesses. So if someone said to me, look, I want to find out about first aid in the workplace, what do I have to do? One of the things I'd be saying to them is that one of the best tools you can use is the code of practice. Now, these are all public documents and can be downloaded off the Safe Work Australia website. And as a resource, I would strongly recommend that you go to the Safe Work Australia website to have a look at these codes of practice. Some will be relevant for the hospitality sector, some will not be relevant. They may be specific for different industries. But they're a guidance material. So they are not passed through Parliament, they are not part of the law. But what they do say, though, is that a business needs to make sure that they're at least complying with this particular guidance material. So it's really about putting in best practice processes for a business. And then we've also got Australian standards. And with Australian standards, again, they're even more specific in terms of legislative requirements. So for example, in the building sector, manufacturing and what have you, they will often need to look at the Australian standards to determine what standards they need to meet to produce, for example, a piece of equipment, to build something in terms of structures and frames and those sorts of things. So we've also got Australian standards. So that's just a bit of a broad sort of overview of the legislation. When we put this legislation in as well, it also refers to some new terminology. In the old OC health and safety legislation, we used to talk about employees and employers. Now, under the work health and safety legislation, we've got some new terminology. And one of the things that we refer to is a PCBU, which is what we call a person conducting a business or undertaking. And effectively what we're trying to do is really broaden the definition to make sure that we're capturing all of the appropriate businesses that work in a particular state from a work health and safety point of view. So traditionally, as we can see, it involves an employer, it might be a partnership, body corporate, it might be an association. So I work for the Australian Hotels Association. The association would be a PCBU. HITsa would be a PCBU. But also it includes volunteer groups, non-for-profit organisations. Red Cross, for example, would be considered a PCBU. We've also got this term of officer. An officer is an interesting sort of terminology because when we talk about officers, it's generally about who has the overall decision-making within a business. Who has the decisions in terms of the financials when it comes to the financials, making ultimate decisions that are going to affect the business. Now, certainly when we look at officers, we think that directors and licensees would be considered officers of the business. We also believe that hotels, if I looked at the hotel environment, a general manager or a hotel manager would also be considered officers. But because this is, from a prosecutory point of view, fairly new legislation, the extent to which someone would be considered an officer or not is yet to be determined. And it could even go down to the level of, for example, a duty manager to be considered an officer. But again, that hasn't been determined yet. But effectively, it's those people that are making major decisions for the business. Worker, well, that's pretty self-explanatory. Employees, contractors, labour hire companies, apprentices. And again, you might have an unusual situation where you've got a worker and a PCBU at the same time. If I'm an electrician, for example, and I have my own business, I would be considered a PCBU. But I might also be considered a worker as well. So we've got some different types of legislation, different types of terminology that's used in the legislation. And you'll see that throughout the literature and resources that you use from a work health and safety point of view. So ultimately, what does all that mean? Well, effectively, I've summarised it by saying really everyone's got responsibilities when it comes to the legislation. The PCBUs have to make sure, so far as reasonably practicable, that they are complying with the legislation. They need to make sure that they've got safe systems of work in place. They need to make sure that they've created an environment, if I look at a hotel for example, that they've created an environment to make sure that employees are safe or workers are safe. Customers that are coming into the hotel are also safe. So if there are electrical wires hanging down from the roof, and I'm not suggesting there would be, but live electrical wires hanging down from the roof, that PCBU would not be ensuring that they are managing the health and safety of customers that are coming into their workplace. Contractors that come in as well. We need to provide a safe environment for contractors. And those people we do, that we use as suppliers, for example, and that we actually conduct business with. So a broad range of responsibilities. Officers is an interesting one. They talk about this term due diligence in the legislation. And really what they're saying is that an officer must exercise due diligence when they're working within their workplace. And that would effectively mean ensuring that the PCBU, so in your case, for the employer, that they are complying with the legislation. So it's a responsibility to ensure that you are complying with the legislation whilst you're conducting your everyday duties. So for example, an officer, if there was an incident in the workplace, an accident in the workplace, it would be their responsibility to make sure they investigated that accident and they managed that accident as appropriately as possible. It's also a responsibility of an officer to ensure that whilst they're working in the workplace, that they're identifying any hazards that may exist and ensuring that if there are hazards, that they're managing the risks associated with those hazards. And then lastly, in terms of workers, well, they have a responsibility. We all have, from my perspective, being a worker at the AHA, I have a responsibility to make sure that I'm following any directions from a work health and safety point of view. But also it means I'm not doing anything which puts the safety of other workers in danger. So if I was to turn up for work intoxicated, for argument's sake, I may indeed be breaching the legislation because I may indeed be putting fellow workers in danger, particularly if I worked in an environment with machinery or in a kitchen where I might be using knives and those sorts of things. So that's just a bit of a brief snapshot in terms of work health and safety. In terms of the legislation with diversity, I wanted to really throw it open to the group this morning, and I'm going to pick on Luke, which I said I wouldn't pick on Luke, as my scribe here. And what I want you to do, because my handwriting's no good, what I want you to do is give me some ideas from your perspective, and I'll just throw it open to you. If I ask you the term of diversity, what do you think diversity means from either a workplace point of view or just generally in terms of the public? What do you think diversity means to you guys? Anything at all? It's not that early.
Change.
Yeah, so change, yeah, dealing with change, yeah, absolutely, yeah. What else? What about the word diverse? What does diverse mean to you?
Different.
Different, yeah, differences, dealing with differences, yeah. If I use the term ethnic diversity, what do you think I mean by that?
Equality.
Yeah, so equality, multiculturalism, yeah. If something's diverse, it's quite different, isn't it? Between one and another. So often when we talk about diversity within the workplace, people can quite often get confused with the term of what does that really mean. But to me, it's really dealing with differences within the workplace. Differences between, for example, employees, whether that be cultural, whether that be based on their belief systems, races, male, female, gender differences, all those sorts of things. Thanks, Lou. We'll get you revved up in a minute anyway. So in terms of diversity, when you look at the legislation, we're really talking about discrimination. What are the sorts of grounds of discrimination that we might be able to look at? So it's unlawful, for example, to discriminate on the basis of age, race, gender, pregnancy. As you can see, there's a whole range. Caring responsibilities. It's unlawful to discriminate on the basis of someone's chosen gender. They might have started working for you as a male, and then later down the track they may identify themselves as being female. It's unlawful to discriminate against someone on the basis of religious dress. To be associated with the child. Issues such as breastfeeding within the workplace and dealing with those. So when we look at diversity, we're really focusing on the differences between individuals.
Union membership.
Union membership, yeah, absolutely. So it's unlawful to discriminate on the basis of being a member of the union or indeed not being a member of the union. Yeah, so that's certainly one of the grounds. I'm not going to attempt to even summarise this legislation for you, but suffice to say, and I know you'll eagerly go away and have a look at these acts as well and read through them, but in terms of a federal perspective, there's a whole range of acts that exist that deal with issues around discrimination, whether it's race, age, gender, all those sorts of things. And they've been around for many, many years and have gone through a number of amendments through Parliament. Here in South Australia, we do have a specific act as well, the Equal Opportunity Act, 1984. Been around, as you can see, for many, many years, but it has gone through a number of different amendments as we've needed to change, particularly in areas like religious dress and chosen gender, association with a child. Those sorts of areas are relatively new from a legislative point of view. And what I would say as a resource, in terms of a resource that I think is really good, the Equal Opportunities Commission have developed a range, here in South Australia, have developed a range of fact sheets, and this is just on chosen gender, but we've also got ones on religious dress, for example. They're really good fact sheets which talk about the grounds in which discrimination may occur and provide some really good practical examples for you as well. So I would certainly have a look at those as a resource. Okay. Workplace bullying. So we've talked a bit about work health and safety, we've talked a bit about diversity and discrimination in that particular area. If I was going to ask you the question again about workplace bullying, what answers do you think you would give me? How would you define workplace bullying?
Feeling uncomfortable in the workplace?
Yeah, so feeling uncomfortable in the workplace. A feeling that it might affect your health, perhaps, your own safety. Yeah, so feeling uncomfortable. What else? What else?
Just being unfairly hard on particular people? Or?
Yeah, so unfairly treating individuals or a group, for example. Yeah, so being unreasonable. Yep. Yep. Do we think that bullying is something that happens as a one-off incident, or is it something that might happen over time, or?
Yeah.
No? Sorry?
Could be anything.
Could be anything? Yeah.
Either.
Could be either? Yeah. What? Sorry, you were going to.
Continuously happens?
Yeah, continuously. Yeah. Well, the key thing with bullying is that over the years, there's been a range of different definitions that have been in place from a state point of view with either work health and safety, and also now with the Fair Work Act, which I'll talk to you in a moment. But there are some key elements to most definitions when it comes to workplace bullying. And as it says there, repeated and unreasonable behaviour directed towards a worker or a group of workers that creates a risk to health and safety. So the core elements there: repeated behaviour, unreasonable behaviour. Now that's often the contentious area. What is unreasonable? It's a good question. What might be reasonable to one may be totally unreasonable to someone else. People often answer that question by saying, well, it's what a reasonable person would think. Not the easiest one to answer, but essentially unreasonable behaviour. But also, it's also got to have an element of risks to health and safety. So someone feels as if it's actually affecting my health, this sort of behaviour. So it might be a psychological issue that's developed by this particular individual that's affecting their health and safety due to this behaviour. But one of the things that it also talks about in most of the legislation is that it doesn't include what we call reasonable management action that's conducted in a reasonable manner. And we're going to go into that a little bit now. When we look at the legislation with bullying, it's really covered in two areas. One, it's covered from a work health and safety point of view under the Work Health and Safety Act here in South Australia, because it talks about psychological hazards and affecting people from a psychological perspective. But also in terms of the industrial relations area, it's also part of the Fair Work Act. So you might have seen a fair bit of media play or literature probably about 12 to 18 months ago about the introduction of anti-bullying legislation in Australia. And what that was all about was that the previous federal government gave the Fair Work Commission, which is the independent overarching body that deals with industrial relations in Australia, they gave them the power to hear complaints that may be raised by employees in the workplace where they believe that they have been bullied. So under the Fair Work Act, a claim can now be lodged by an employee to suggest that they believe that they have been bullied in the workplace. Importantly as well, it might be a claim of bullying against another employee. It's not necessarily a claim against the employer. It could even be, I'm trying to think of an example, but it could even be a bullying claim against a contractor that has come into the workplace. Someone who might be self-employed, who might be, particularly in a building site, it might be some sorts of behaviours that are actually affecting that particular employee in their workplace. So we've got legislation there to deal with bullying behaviour. Now the Fair Work Commission, in terms of hearing any complaints about bullying, doesn't have the ability to order compensation when it comes to bullying claims, but they do have the ability to make orders like changing policies and procedures, getting staff to undertake training, and effectively putting through an order to stop the bullying from occurring if they believe that bullying behaviour has occurred. So they certainly have a wide range of powers. In terms of workplace bullying, we often talk about behaviours that may create a bullying scenario. What sort of behaviour do you think could possibly be construed as bullying? Bearing in mind that you've got to look at every situation in its entirety. What sort of behaviour do you think could be construed as bullying type behaviour?
Aggression.
Yeah, being aggressive towards an employee.
Physical.
Yeah, physical, absolutely. And that does happen. Physical abuse. Yeah. What else?
Just verbal comments.
Yeah, so verbal comments,
Jokes,
insults, jokes,
inappropriate jokes.
You know, that old adage of the apprentice that comes in for their first day of work and they've got to go through the initiation ceremony and they're the butt of practical jokes and those sorts of things.
Social media.
Yeah, so through social media, yeah, bullying behaviour, and that's a really interesting one because often people sort of think, well, I'm on Facebook, I'm outside of work, I can pretty much say what I like about another work colleague. Well, that's not actually the case, particularly if your employer has a policy on social media use and what might be construed as bullying behaviour. Yeah, these are what I'd call probably the more direct forms of bullying. You know, language, inappropriate, you know, spreading rumours and gossip, innuendos, making teasing type comments, degrading, all those sorts of things. So what I'd call more direct. But we've also got things that would be considered more subtle, if you like, indirect forms of bullying. So deliberately setting unrealistic timeframes, deadlines, those sorts of things. And again, that can be a lot more contentious. What is a realistic deadline and what's not? And again, that's where a lot of commentary surrounds this area of workplace bullying. But it may be, for example, putting someone on a roster knowing full well that they can't work on that day without the business necessarily needing that person to work on that day. Could be construed as bullying type behaviour. Deliberately denying them access to information, excluding them. So if we've talked about those sort of behaviours that could be construed as workplace bullying perhaps, what do you think we mean when we talk about reasonable management action? What do you think we'd mean by that? What sort of things would be considered reasonable management action, do you think?
Written warnings.
Yeah, so written warnings, dealing with unsatisfactory performance. If someone is not performing to the set standards that they need to, then you may need to go through a performance management process with them. It may lead to a written warning. That would be considered reasonable management practice. What else?
Sending staff to training like this.
Yeah, so going to training sessions, those sorts of things. Yeah, encouraging training. Yeah, yeah.
Just talking to the people involved and trying to figure out what's going on and stop it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, dealing with complaints. If complaints arise, actually dealing with those issues as well. Yeah. Do you guys go through any performance management sessions or reviews on a? You do, yeah, on a yearly basis or every 6 months, for example. Again, realistic management action, going through, setting some goals with you, understanding what your tasks are, and reviewing those would all be considered realistic management action. If a business had to go through organisational change and restructuring and that sort of area, again, there's obviously technicalities from an IR legislative point of view, but certainly that would be considered reasonable management action. So again, just because an individual is getting counselled about a particular issue doesn't mean that they're being bullied. Okay, I might get Fleur to assist me in this process. What I would like you to do is, and I think off the top of my head there's 31 or 32, but I'm not sure, but I'd like you to get into 6 different groups of around 5 people, and one of them's obviously going to be 6 or 7. But what we've got is we've got some examples of discrimination and workplace bullying. Now, Fleur's going to allocate a number to you in terms of groups. Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4, Group 5, Group 6. And what I need you to do is, in your group, I'll give you sort of 5 minutes or so, and you can use this area here, or I think there's actually some area outside in a breakout area that you could use, where what I want you to do is have a read through the scenario. So if you're Group 1, you'd look through Group 1's scenario. And if it's a bullying scenario, what it will do is ask you the question, based on reading this, do you believe this person has been subjected to workplace bullying? And if so, what led you to that conclusion? For those that have got a discrimination example, what I want you to have a look at is, do you think this person's been discriminated against? And if so, on what grounds do you think they've been discriminated against? Then when we come back, I'd just like one person, perhaps from the group, to just give us the answers in terms of what your group came up with, having read that particular scenario. Does that make sense? Yeah? Excellent. All right. Well, as I said, I'll give you 5 to 10 minutes just to work through those. And again, you've got this area as well as outside areas as well if you want to stretch your legs a little bit.